The sound reached Callum before anything else did, not the kind of crying that polite strangers pretended not to hear, but the kind that had already given up on pretending. Raw, exhausted. The sound of someone who had been holding something enormous for a very long time and had finally completely let it go. He stopped walking. Wren's small hand was still tucked inside his, and she'd felt him stop before she heard it herself. She tilted her face up toward him. That particular look she had, the one that said she was already processing something her 6-year-old vocabulary hadn't caught up to yet. The May air was warm and clean, the kind of Saturday that made Hartford feel generous, and the side garden of Hartwell Chapel was thick with the smell of roses and fresh-cut grass. They had arrived 40 minutes early. The birthday party for Wren's classmate didn't start until 2, and Callum had promised to help with setup. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned any of this. "Daddy," Wren's whisper was careful. "Somebody's really sad." He crouched down to her level right there on the stone path. "Stay right here by this door, okay? Don't move. I'll be back in 1 minute." She nodded with the grave seriousness she reserved for moments she understood mattered. Callum straightened, rounded the corner of the chapel's stone wall, and stopped dead. The garden opened up on the other side, a modest rectangle of white rose bushes, a stone bench, a wrought iron arch that someone had woven with ribbon and small white flowers that morning. The ribbon was still there. The flowers were still there. The petals that had fallen from the arch lay scattered across the stone path like the aftermath of something that had been beautiful before it became wreckage. And in the middle of it, in a wheelchair, in a wedding dress, was a woman who had clearly run out of road. The dress was the kind that took months to choose ivory lace over the sleeves, a full skirt that had been carefully arranged around the chair's footrest, a cathedral train that pooled behind her like spilled milk. Her hair was pinned up with small white flowers woven through the coils, one of them listing sideways, now coming loose. Her makeup had been applied with the kind of precision that required a steady hand and a lot of time, and all of it was ruined. Mascara tracked down both cheeks in long, dark lines. Her hands, bare except for the engagement ring that caught the morning light, gripped the armrests of the wheelchair with a force that had gone white at the knuckles. She hadn't heard him. She was somewhere far past noticing. Callum stood at the edge of the garden and understood with the particular clarity of someone who had once been on the floor of his own kitchen at 2 a.m. with a sick child and an empty house that he was looking at a person at the absolute end of something. He took 1 step back. He could still leave. She hadn't seen him. It would be clean, private, respectful. Even some people needed their worst moments witnessed by no one. Then she looked up. Her eyes were hazel red-rimmed, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the scattered petals and the ruined morning. He watched the sequence move across her face, startled, then embarrassed, then something that looked almost like resignation, as though she had already lost so much today that one more witness to it barely registered. "I'm sorry." Her voice came out rough, scraped hollow. "I didn't think anyone would be back here." Callum took a careful step forward. Not close, just enough. "Are you okay?" The laugh that came out of her was not a happy sound. She looked down at herself, the dress, the chair, the fallen petals, and then back at him with an expression that said the question had answered itself. "Today was supposed to be my wedding day." The words came out flat, like something she'd already said in her head so many times they'd lost their shape. "The guests are inside. My fiancé told me 30 minutes ago that he can't do it. He's gone." The air in the garden seemed to change quality. Callum didn't say anything. He knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had learned this the hard way that there was nothing useful to say in the first 30 seconds of a sentence like that, and that the worst thing a stranger could offer was a reflexive platitude that would make her feel more alone than she already did. "He said he tried." Her jaw tightened. She looked somewhere past his shoulder like the target of her anger was still visible from here. "He said he really, really tried to be okay with it, but he couldn't look at me in this dress and know that this is what our life would look like, and—" She stopped. Her hand came down hard on the armrest of the wheelchair, a sharp crack of sound in the quiet garden. "Because I can't walk." He left because I can't walk." Callum felt the words land somewhere behind his sternum and stay there. "He said he wanted a normal wife." The last two words came out with a precision that had nothing to do with calm. "He said he couldn't give me the life I deserved, as though that was something he was doing for me." She finally looked back at him fully. He could see her deciding in real time whether to send him away or keep talking, whether the presence of another human being was a comfort or an intrusion. He didn't move. He didn't rush her toward either answer. "8 months ago," she started and then stopped, and then kept going as though the words had been dammed up for long enough. "I was working a closing shift alone at the veterinary clinic where I'd been for 4 years. I loved that job. I was good at it." A pause. "There was a storage rack in the supply room, heavy-gauge steel full of equipment. It had been tagged for repair for 3 months. No one got around to it." She didn't say the rest. She didn't have to. "The surgery saved my life," she said, "but my spine, the damage was too extensive. I'll never walk again." She said it with the directness of someone who had worked very hard to be able to say it that way without flinching, because flinching gave it more power than she was willing to let it have. "Garrett said he'd stay. He came to the hospital every day. He held my hand through rehab. He said it didn't matter, that we'd get through it together. We postponed the wedding 6 months so I could focus on recovery, and he seemed—" She pressed her lips together. "He seemed like he meant it. I believed him. And then 3 weeks ago things started to shift. Small things. He stopped reaching for my hand. When he helped me with the chair, there was something in his face, this flicker of something I told myself I was imagining because I wanted so badly to believe he was the person he said he was." Her voice cracked on the last few words, and she pressed on straight through the crack. "This morning I was in the bridal room with my sister. I was nervous and happy, and I was thinking about standing at the front of that church, and then Garrett walked in. He wasn't supposed to see me before the ceremony. Bad luck." Another hollow sound, not quite a laugh. "He said he needed to talk, and then he told me he couldn't. That he'd spent months trying to convince himself he was okay and he wasn't. That he wanted a normal life." The silence that followed had weight. "He didn't leave through the front," she said quietly. "I found out later. He went out the back door. My sister Sloane, she's the one who had to go out and tell 200 people that the wedding wasn't happening. She stood up there alone and told all of them, and I was out here." Callum had been a single father for 4 years. He had learned in that time that there was a specific kind of pain that came not from your own wound, but from watching someone else absorb a blow they hadn't earned and couldn't have prevented, and it was in some ways worse than the wound itself, because there was nothing to do with it. It just had to be held. "I'm sorry," he said. He said it the way he meant it, without decoration. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something exhausted in her expression, but also something watchful. She was trying to read him, trying to determine whether his presence here was kindness or curiosity. He stayed still and let her look. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I'm not going to. I'm fine. I just needed a minute out here." "I know I don't have to." She blinked. Something shifted slightly in her face, some small adjustment around the eyes. "The worst part," she said, and then stopped, like she was deciding whether to say the actual worst part or a safer version of it. She chose the actual one. "Everyone will understand why he left. That's what I keep thinking. People will hear this story, and they'll nod, and they'll say it makes sense that it was too much to ask, that he tried his best. They'll feel sorry for me. And for the rest of my life, this is what people will know about me first. The woman in the wheelchair who got left at the altar because her fiancé decided she was too difficult. That's not your story." The words came out before Callum had weighed them, and he let them stand. She looked at him with something that was almost sharpness. "You don't know what my story is." "No. But I know you're the one who gets to decide what it is. Not him, not the people inside that church. You." He paused. "What happened today tells you exactly who he is. It doesn't say one thing about who you are." She looked away. Her hands had loosened slightly on the armrests. She was still crying, or had been recently enough that her breathing was still uneven, but something in her posture had changed. Some degree of the terrible isolation of the last 30 minutes had been fractionally reduced. "You say that like it's easy," she said. "It's not." He didn't try to make it sound like it was. "I'm not standing here telling you this doesn't hurt or that it'll be okay by next week or any of that. I'm just saying the thing he did today is his to carry, not yours." She was quiet for a moment. The garden held them both in the warm morning light, indifferent to the occasion. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Not suspiciously, just the question of someone whose mind had started incrementally to work again. "Birthday party. My daughter's classmate. The community hall." He glanced back in the direction he'd come. "We arrived early to help set up. I left her by the door with very clear instructions not to move." Something crossed her face the first thing in the last several minutes that hadn't been grief. "How old?" "6. Her name is Wren. And she's definitely still standing exactly where you left her." "Absolutely not." She almost smiled. It didn't fully form, but it was the shape of one. Callum took a breath. He'd been standing at the edge of the garden this whole time, and now he made a decision. Not a complicated one, just the one that felt right, and walked over to the bench near the rose arch and sat down. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be present. Her mother left when Wren was 2. He said it without preamble because she had been honest with him, and it seemed wrong to offer something curated in return. "Wren has epilepsy. It's managed mostly, but there are hard stretches. Her mother said she couldn't handle the uncertainty of it, the hospital visits, the fear of not knowing when the next seizure might come. She said she needed a different life." He looked at the fallen petals on the path in front of him. "She walked out. We haven't heard from her since." The woman in the wedding dress was very still. "I'm not telling you that to compare," he said. "I'm telling you because I know what it feels like to have someone look at the reality of your life and decide it's more than they signed up for. And I know that when that happens, the thing that gets into your head, the thing that's hardest to shake, is the idea that they might be right, that maybe you are too much, that maybe the life you have is too complicated to be worth choosing." "Is it?" Her voice was very quiet. "No." He said it without hesitation. "But it takes a while to get back to knowing that. And it's not a straight line." She was looking at him now with an expression he recognized, the look of someone who has been in a room full of people saying well-meaning things and has finally heard something that sounds like the actual truth. "What's your name?" she asked. "Callum. Callum Foster." "Tessa." She didn't offer a last name. It didn't feel like an omission so much as an instinct, some part of her that wasn't ready to be fully named again yet. "I was a veterinary assistant, before." She glanced down at her hands. The engagement ring caught the light again. "I don't know what I am now." "You're the same thing you were before," Callum said. "You just don't know that yet either." Tessa looked at the ring for a long moment. Then slowly and with complete deliberateness, she pulled it off her finger and set it on the armrest of the wheelchair. Not thrown, not flung, just set down, like closing a door. The sound of small footsteps on stone came from around the corner before either of them had time to react, and then Wren appeared at the edge of the garden, both braids coming slightly undone, eyes going wide as they landed on Tessa. Callum opened his mouth. Wren spoke first. "Wow." Her voice was full of uncomplicated awe. "You look like a princess." Tessa made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but contained elements of both. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm Wren." She walked forward without hesitation, completely unbothered by the wheelchair, the ruined mascara, or the general atmosphere of catastrophe that was obvious to any adult within range. She stopped beside Tessa and tilted her head. "Why are you sad?" "Princesses in books are always sad at first, and then something good happens." Tessa's expression did something complicated and then settled into something softer. "Sometimes even princesses have really bad days." Wren considered this with visible seriousness. "My daddy says bad days don't last forever. He says the sun always comes back even after the rain." She glanced back at Callum with a look that said he had better confirm this. He gave her a small nod. "Your daddy is right," Tessa said. "Can I sit with you?" Wren was already lowering herself onto the garden path beside the wheelchair, folding her legs underneath her. "You look like you could use a friend. I'm good at being a friend. My teacher said so." Tessa looked down at this small, self-possessed person who had just installed herself at her side without waiting for an invitation, and something in her face changed in a way that was almost imperceptible but wasn't. Some tension that had been wound very tight began fractionally to release. Wren reached up and touched one of the white flowers in Tessa's hair, the one that had come loose from its pin. "These are really pretty. Did somebody put them there special?" "My sister did, this morning." Tessa's voice was careful. "She spent a long time getting them right." "Well, she did good." Wren said this with complete authority. Then she leaned forward and began gathering the fallen rose petals from the path around them, sorting them into a small pile with the focused energy of someone who has identified a project. Callum watched his daughter for a moment. This child, who had been born into a harder situation than most, and had somehow come out of it with more openness toward other people's pain than most adults he knew, and then he made a second decision. He sat down on the garden path across from them, right there in his jeans, back against the stone bench legs, stretched out in front of him. Tessa stared at him. "You really don't have to do that." "I know." She looked at him for another beat, and then something in her gave up arguing about it. "The party's set up. There are other adults in there. They'll manage." Wren had finished gathering petals and was now arranging them into a shape that was either a bouquet or a sun, depending on interpretation. She presented it to Tessa with both hands. "Every princess needs flowers. These ones already fell, so we're not hurting the bushes." Tessa accepted the collection of petals with both hands and held them with a care that had nothing to do with their monetary value. "Thank you." "Daddy?" Wren looked at him with sudden inspiration. "Can you play music? We should have a party, a happy party, because the sad one didn't work." Callum looked at Tessa. Tessa looked back at him. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through, and found something acoustic guitar, low and unhurried, a voice that wasn't trying too hard. He set it on the bench beside him where the sound could reach all three of them. The garden held them in the warm morning, petals on the path ribbon still on the arch, and the three of them in a loose circle. A man in work jeans sitting on the ground, a little girl arranging flowers with executive authority, and a woman in a wedding dress holding a handful of rose petals like they were something worth keeping. "What's your favorite animal?" Wren asked. The question came from nowhere or from everywhere, from the endless practical curiosity of a child who had already moved past the sad part and was interested in the person now. Tessa blinked. Then, and Callum watched this happen, watched the shift move through her like something loosening, she actually thought about it. "I love all of them. But dogs, probably." I used to say that wasn't a real answer when people asked me at work because it felt too easy. But it's true. "We had a hamster, but it died," Wren reported solemnly. "Daddy said maybe we could get a dog someday when we have a bigger yard." "What kind?" "A big one, with floppy ears. A basset hound." Wren's face lit up. "Is that a real dog?" "Very real. They look like they're made of extra skin, and they have the most serious expressions, like they're thinking about something very important all the time." Wren dissolved into giggles. Callum found himself smiling without having decided to. Tessa noticed and looked away, but not before he caught the edge of something real on her face. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the memory of it. The knowledge that it was still possible. They stayed in the garden a while longer. Sloane appeared at the garden entrance, at one point a woman a few years older than Tessa, with the same bone structure and the look of someone who had been holding an entire situation together through sheer determined competence. She stopped when she saw the three of them, confusion moving across her face and then resolving into something more careful. "Tess," her voice was quiet. "Mom and Dad are inside. Most people have gone, but we need to figure out—" She stopped. She looked at Tessa's face. "Are you okay?" "No," Tessa said. The word came out steady without apology. "But I'm going to be." Sloane looked at Callum and Wren with an expression that was still working out what to make of them. Callum gave a small nod. The kind that said, "Nothing alarming is happening here. Your person is safe." Whatever she read in it, it was enough. She looked back at Tessa. A few more minutes. A few more minutes. Sloane disappeared back around the chapel wall. When Tessa's parents appeared a little while later, her father's face a controlled mask over barely contained fury. Her mother red-eyed and holding the composure of someone who had been holding it all morning. Callum stood, brushed the grass from his jeans, and understood that this part was over. "I should let you go," he said. Tessa looked up at him. In the space of the last hour, something in her face had changed. Not fixed, nowhere near fixed, but slightly less shattered than it had been when he'd come around the corner and found her. The worst of the acutest pain had been witnessed, which was different from being cured, but not nothing. "Before you do," he said. He pulled a small notepad from his back pocket. He carried it out of habit for job site measurements and wrote his number on it. He handed it to her. "No pressure, no expectations. If you ever want someone to talk to who understands what it's like to be on the other end of a promise that didn't hold, I'm around." Tessa took the paper. Her fingers were steady now. "Why are you being this kind? You don't know me." He thought about it for a second, not performing the thought, actually having it. "Because 4 years ago, when my wife left, I felt like I was underwater and everyone around me was on the surface and no one reached down. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone at that particular depth, I'd reach, even if it was awkward, even if I was a stranger." He paused. "I can't go back and fix what nobody did for me, but I can be here now." Tessa held the paper with both hands. She looked at it for a moment, then at him, then at Wren, who had appeared at Callum's side and was looking at Tessa with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who had already decided how this story ended. "Bye, Princess Tessa." Wren reached up and hugged Tessa's arm briefly and fiercely. "I hope tomorrow is better." Tessa hugged her back with one arm, and when she pulled away her eyes were full, but the thing behind them was different from what had been there when Callum first found her. "Thank you for my party," she said. Callum and Wren walked back around the chapel wall hand in hand, and Tessa watched them go. Her father was beside her now, his hand on her shoulder, his jaw tight with the particular rage of a parent who cannot protect their child from a wound that has already landed. Her mother stood close on the other side. Sloane was on her phone a few feet away, quietly and efficiently dismantling the logistical remains of a wedding that hadn't happened. Tessa looked down at the small piece of notepad paper in her hands. Callum Foster. A phone number in neat, practical handwriting. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside the bodice of the wedding dress over her heart. Not because she was certain she'd call, not because she had any clear sense of what came next, but because it was evidence of something she needed to remember right now. That a stranger had come around a corner on the worst morning of her life and sat down in the grass and stayed. Not because she'd asked, not because it was convenient, just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Her father began to wheel her toward the parking lot. The chapel garden receded behind them, the rose arch still wound with ribbon, the scattered petals on the stone path, the bench where Callum had sat and listened. The place where a party had been assembled from fallen flowers, and a phone playing quiet guitar, and a 6-year-old's absolute conviction that things would get better. Tessa looked at it until she couldn't anymore. That evening she sat in her apartment in comfortable clothes, her hair loose, the wedding dress hanging on the back of her bedroom door because she hadn't figured out yet what to do with it. The afternoon had been a controlled disaster return calls to the caterer, a brief and brutal conversation with the wedding venue, her mother sitting beside her on the couch, saying things that were kind and true and not quite enough. Garrett had sent one text, "I'm sorry. I hope you understand." She'd read it once and put the phone face down and hadn't picked it up again for 2 hours. When she did, there was another message. "Unknown number. Just wanted to make sure you got home okay. No need to respond if you're not up for it. Just wanted you to know someone is thinking of you tonight." Tessa sat with the phone in both hands for a long time. She thought about the garden. She thought about a man she'd never met before sitting down on the ground in his jeans because standing over her felt wrong. She thought about Wren and the rose petals and the music and the small unconscious kindness of a child who had not asked a single question about the wheelchair because it had simply not occurred to her to see it as the most important thing in the room. She thought about what Callum had said, not the part about it getting better because she'd heard variations of that all afternoon and it had bounced off her. She thought about the other thing. The part about reaching down because nobody reached for him. The part about not being able to fix the past but being able to show up for someone else's present. She thought about the half-second of hesitation in Garrett's eyes when she'd believed truly, without reservation, believed that she was marrying someone who saw her. Not her wheelchair, not her injury. Her. She'd been wrong about that. But she hadn't been wrong about what she deserved. Her fingers moved before she'd fully decided, I'm home. Thank you. For stopping. For staying. It meant more than you know. She sent it before she could rethink it. 3 minutes later, her phone lit up. I'm glad. And I meant it if you ever need someone to talk to. I'm here. No expectations. Just someone who gets it. She looked at the message for a while. Outside the apartment window, Hartford was doing what cities did in the evening, indifferent and continuous. The dress on her bedroom door caught the lamplight and glowed faintly. She typed, I might take you up on that. Fair warning. I'm kind of a mess right now. The reply came quickly. Aren't we all? Get some rest, Tessa. Tomorrow is a new day. She set the phone down. She leaned back against the couch cushions and breathed in and out and let the quiet of the apartment settle around her. The day that had been designed to be the most significant of her life had been instead a particular kind of devastation. And yet somewhere in the wreckage of it, in a garden full of fallen rose petals, a stranger had sat down beside her and refused to treat her as though she was already over. That wasn't everything, but it was not nothing. For the first time since Garrett had walked into the bridal room that morning and closed the door behind him, Tessa did not feel entirely alone. She couldn't have said why that specific thing. A text message from a man she had known for 1 hour in a morning of people who had known her for years was what finally let her breathe. Maybe because it had come without obligation. Maybe because it had been offered freely by someone who had 1,000 reasons to keep walking and had chosen not to. She reached over to the small side table where she'd set the folded piece of notepad paper earlier. She picked it up, unfolded it. Callum Foster, in that practical handwriting. She refolded it and held it. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know how long the hurt would last or what shape her life would have on the other side of it, or whether she'd recognize herself when she got there. She knew the wedding dress had to come down from the door. She knew there would be more days like today before there were better ones. She knew that Garrett's cowardice did not obligate her to carry it, even though she would for a while because that was how grief worked. But she also knew, with the specific bone-tired clarity of someone who has been broken open in front of a stranger and emerged less alone than when they started, that the story wasn't over. That the garden that morning was not the end of something, even though it had felt like it. That somewhere in the sequence of terrible and unexpected events that had constituted May 14, 2023, something had also begun. She didn't know yet what to call it. She only knew it was there. The texts came without pressure and without pattern, which was exactly why they worked. Callum didn't message every morning like a routine she'd have to maintain or disappoint. He didn't check in with the hovering frequency of someone waiting to be needed. He just appeared at irregular intervals with the unpretentious consistency of someone who had meant what he said and left it at that. A Tuesday afternoon, Wren informed me today that Basset Hounds are the most serious dogs, and she wants one named Gerald. A Thursday morning, hope the week is treating you okay. No response required, just wanted to say it. Small things. Things that asked nothing back except occasionally the truth. Tessa found herself looking forward to them. That realization arrived quietly without announcement somewhere around the second week of June when she caught herself smiling at her phone before she'd fully processed what she was reading. She set the phone face down and sat with that for a moment, the fact of it, the simple animal fact that something had made her smile without effort, and understood it meant more than it appeared to. Then she picked the phone back up and typed. They met for coffee the first time on a Saturday in late May, 11 days after the garden. A place in West Hartford with wide doorways and no steps at the entrance, Callum had mentioned it casually as though he'd simply recalled it, and Tessa understood without either of them acknowledging it that he had checked in advance. Wren came with them bringing a coloring book and an organizational system for her crayons that she explained in full before opening to the first page. She colored with the focused dedication of a professional and periodically offered observations that were not requests for feedback so much as dispatches from her own interior process. Tessa and Callum talked. Not about the wedding that hadn't happened, not about Nicole, not about anything that required careful handling. They talked about Hartford in the summer and which parks had the best walking paths and whether the coffee here was actually good or just reliably adequate. He told her about his work contracting and custom carpentry, mostly residential, the particular satisfaction of building something physical that would outlast the building of it. She told him about a dog she'd treated the year before the accident, an elderly beagle named Copernicus, who had arrived at the clinic in full cardiac distress and left 6 hours later with a prognosis that had surprised everyone in the room, including the vet. The story had no point beyond itself, and they both knew it, and that was exactly why she told it. When they left, Wren hugged Tessa's arm the same way she had in the garden, briefly and completely, like it was the most natural thing, and Tessa felt something she hadn't felt since before the accident. Not happiness, not yet, but the ground under happiness, the specific texture of possibility. The animal therapy program began in early June. It was run out of a rehabilitation center in Hartford twice a week, pairing therapy animals with pediatric patients in recovery. Tessa had found it through a contact from her old clinic, a coordinator who'd tracked her down after the accident to say the position existed if she ever wanted it. She'd let the email sit unanswered for 3 months, then 6. She'd answered it on a Sunday night in late May, without letting herself think too long about it, the way you sometimes have to make the important decisions quickly before the part of your brain that catalogs reasons not to can get fully organized. Her first session was on a Wednesday morning. She arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the parking lot with both hands on her wheels and the particular quality of stillness that precedes something that matters. The automatic doors were wide. The hallway was smooth. She had been in rooms like this from the other side of the equation, and some part of her nervous system still remembered what they smelled like. The antiseptic and recycled air that she associated now with a period of her life she was still in the process of filing correctly. She went in anyway. The work came back in pieces, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the way that something genuinely known returns after disuse underneath the rust intact. She knew how to read an animal's body language and how to introduce a dog to a child who'd never held one, and how to sit with a kid who wasn't ready to engage yet without making the not readiness into a problem. She knew how to be quiet in a way that felt like company rather than abandonment. The Saturday following her first week, Callum and Wren came to see her. They arrived just as the morning session was wrapping up, and Tessa was outside in the small courtyard of the facility with a golden retriever named Patch, and a child who had slowly over the course of 40 minutes gone from refusing to look at the dog to resting his chin on the top of its head with his eyes closed. The child was 9 years old. He'd been in a cycling accident in April that had left him with partial paralysis in his left leg, and he had not, according to his care team, spoken more than a few words to any adult since his admission. He'd talked to Tessa within the first 10 minutes, not because she'd said anything particularly right, but because she'd pulled up alongside him in her chair and let him look at her wheels, and he'd said, "Does it hurt?" And she'd said, "Not anymore." And something in that specific exchange, the plainness of it, the absence of reassurance, had opened a door that months of careful therapeutic language hadn't located the handle to. Callum arrived with Wren in time to see the tail end of it, the boy's mother crying quietly near the courtyard wall, the staff coordinator with an expression of contained relief, and Tessa in the center of all of it, unhurried and completely present, asking the boy if he wanted to know Patch's favorite trick. Callum stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched, and didn't say anything for a long moment, and in that silence he understood something he hadn't had language for yet. He'd been showing up because it was the right thing, because she was someone worth showing up for, because of the promise he'd made himself in a harder time. Those things were all true. But watching her be exactly what a 9-year-old boy needed at exactly the right moment without any performance of it Without any awareness that she was doing something remarkable, he understood that something else had also been happening in the months since the chapel garden. Something quieter and more inconvenient and impossible to put back once you'd seen it clearly. He didn't say anything about it, not then. But he stopped pretending it wasn't there. When Tessa finally wheeled over to them, Wren launched into immediate rapture over Patch, who was extremely receptive to rapture. Callum produced the sign from Wren's backpack cardboard, hand-lettered in Wren's colored markers, with his steadier hand evident in the larger letters, "We're proud of you, Tessa." Wren had decorated the border with dogs of varying anatomical accuracy. Tessa looked at it for a beat too long and then looked away because if she kept looking she was going to cry in a rehabilitation center courtyard, and she had already cried in front of this man once in considerably more dramatic circumstances. She took the sign and put it in her bag without making a production of it, and it was on her kitchen counter when she got home, and it was still there 2 weeks later, and she didn't move it. Garrett came back on a Tuesday in mid-July, 7 weeks after the chapel. He found her at the rehabilitation center, which meant he had looked deliberately and found where she was. He was waiting near the entrance when she came out after the morning session, thinner, the particular gray of someone who hadn't been sleeping well for a while. He asked if she'd talk to him. Just a few minutes. He asked the way someone asks when they know they have no claim to the answer being yes. She said yes anyway. They went to a bench near the parking lot in the open. He'd been in therapy. He said this as a fact, not a credential. Over the 7 weeks since he'd walked out the back of Hartwell Chapel, he'd come to understand a series of things about himself that he clearly found uncomfortable to report, that his fear had never been about Tessa, but about the shape of a life he couldn't predict or control, that he'd confused his own limitations with a verdict about what she deserved, that the specific cowardice of waiting until the wedding day was something he'd be working out for a long time. He didn't ask to come back. He said this plainly in a way that suggested he'd thought carefully about what he'd actually earned the right to ask for, and had arrived at a specific, smaller answer. He wanted her to know that he understood what he'd done. Tessa listened to all of it with the exhausted clarity of someone past the worst of the inflammation when what remains is just the clean shape of the thing. She asked him one question. "When did you know?" His voice was careful. "February. I knew in February that I wasn't going to be able to get past it. I should have told you then. I told myself I'd find a way through. I kept waiting for the feeling to change." A pause. "It didn't change. I just ran out of time." February. 3 months before the wedding. 3 months of plans and deposits and decisions made inside a reality that had already quietly shifted without her knowledge. Tessa let herself feel the full weight of that, not around it, not above it, through it, because she'd learned by now that avoidance only relocated the weight somewhere less accessible. "I'm not forgiving you today," she said. "I don't know when or if I will, but I hear what you're saying." She met his eyes for what felt like the first time in the conversation. "I spent a long time after you left wondering if I'd asked too much just by being in this chair and expecting someone to stay. I'm done with that question. I want you to know that." Garrett nodded. He didn't try to add to it. He stood, reached into his jacket, and set a folded piece of paper on the bench beside her, wrinkled at the creases, the soft wear of something carried for months. "I wrote this in February. I never sent it." He walked to his car without looking back. Tessa looked at the paper for a long time. She put it in her bag, and when she got home, she put it in a drawer, and she left it there. That evening she called Callum. Not texted, called, which was new. He picked up on the second ring. She told him the shape of the conversation, that Garrett had come, that he'd said what he'd come to say, that she'd held her ground and meant it, that she was okay. Callum listened the way he listened, without filling the space prematurely, without offering a verdict she hadn't asked for. When she finished, he didn't analyze it. He just said, "Do you want company?" She said yes. He was there within the hour, and they spent the evening on her apartment patio with takeout, going cold between them, talking about everything except what had happened that afternoon. Wren's summer reading program, a job site in Simsbury, where the foundation had turned out to be considerably more creative than the blueprint suggested, a therapy dog Tessa had worked with that week who was convinced his back right paw belonged to someone else. The evening went dark around them gradually, and neither of them moved to end it. She didn't notice until afterward that she hadn't thought about Garrett once after the first 10 minutes. It was in the weeks following that conversation that Tessa started pulling back from Callum. She recognized it happening and couldn't stop it, which was its own particular frustration, the full awareness of a self-protective reflex that had arrived too late to be useful and was now aimed at entirely the wrong target. She canceled a coffee. She took longer to respond to texts. She understood clearly and uselessly that what she was actually afraid of was not Callum but the specific vulnerability of needing someone again. Sloane showed up on a Thursday afternoon unannounced with groceries and the expression of someone who had decided to say a thing and was not going to be argued out of it. She made pasta. When they were eating, she set down her fork and said, "You're doing it again." Tessa didn't pretend not to understand. "I'm being careful." "You're being careful with someone who has never given you a single reason to be careful with him." Sloane's voice was direct, without being unkind, the voice of someone who had earned the right to say hard things. "Every wall you're putting up right now was built for Garrett. You're just accidentally leaving them standing for Callum." Tessa pushed food around her plate. "What if I'm wrong? What if I let myself need him completely, and then one day the reality of all this, the small gesture, the one that meant the chair and everything organized around it, becomes more than he wants to hold? What if I'm wrong about him the same way I was wrong about Garrett?" Sloane was quiet for a moment, choosing the right thing rather than the easy one. "Then you'll have been wrong, and you'll rebuild the way you rebuilt after Garrett, except faster and from a higher floor, because you'll know you survived it once." She picked her fork back up. "But Tess, being wrong about Callum is a risk you take by opening up. The thing you're doing right now, that's not protection. That's just making sure you lose him without him ever having the chance to stay." Tessa didn't answer. She didn't argue either. The distinction Sloane had drawn between the risk of being wrong and the certainty of self-imposed loss sat in her chest in a way that didn't move. She was still thinking about it 3 weeks later when August arrived and everything else became secondary. The night Wren was admitted to Hartford General was August 9th, a Friday, just after 2 in the morning. Tessa's phone rang and she was awake and reaching for it before the sound had fully registered the way she'd learned to sleep since the accident, lightly, with one part of her always listening. Callum's name on the screen. She answered before the second ring completed. His voice was controlled in the specific way of someone who has had practice being controlled in emergencies, not the absence of fear, but its active management fear compressed into function. Wren had seized in her sleep. It had been a long one. They were at Hartford General. She was stable now, but it had been, he stopped. Restarted. It was one of the worst she's had. "I'm on my way." She was already moving, reaching for her jacket in the dark. "You don't have to." "I'm on my way," she said again, the same words but heavier the second time. And he understood they weren't up for discussion. 40 minutes later, she pushed through the entrance of Hartford General and navigated to the pediatric wing. Callum was in a chair near the window, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, staring at the middle distance with the look of someone who has been alone with a specific fear for long enough that it has expanded to fill all available space. He looked up when he heard her wheels on the linoleum. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly, but the particular easing of a person who has been braced against the full weight of something and has just been handed a small portion of it back. She pulled up beside him and put her hand over his without speaking. His hands were cold. He gave her the clinical update in a flat, careful voice: stable seizure, stopped medication adjustment overnight, observation, and then stopped. She didn't recognize me when she came around. It took a few minutes. His voice held the whole way through. Those few minutes were the longest of my life. "But she did," Tessa said. "She came back to you." "Yeah." A long exhale. First thing she asked for was water. Second thing was whether Gerald could visit. Tessa felt something ease in her own chest. "That's Wren." "That's Wren," he said, and the ghost of something almost like a smile moved across his exhaustion. They stayed through the rest of the night, the particular soundscape of a pediatric ward, in the small hours quieter than days but never fully still. They talked in intervals and were quiet in intervals, and neither felt the need to maintain one register or the other. The waiting room was institutional and uncomfortable, and neither of them mentioned it. At some point, Tessa's hand was no longer on his, and at some point it was again, and she couldn't have said when either transition happened. Wren was cleared just after 7. When Tessa was brought back to see her, Wren was sitting up in a hospital bed wearing a gown printed with cartoon stars smaller than usual and entirely herself. Her face when she saw Tessa was uncomplicated and complete. "You came." "Of course I came." Wren turned to Callum with the expression of someone whose prediction has been validated. "I told you she would." Callum drove them home in the early morning light, Wren asleep in the back seat within minutes of the car moving. He and Tessa rode in silence for a while. Not the vigil silence of the waiting room, but something different. The silence of people who have been through something together and are now on the other side of it, still processing the shape. Then Callum spoke, his voice low under the sound of the road. "There's something I've been not saying, and tonight made me understand I'm not interested in continuing to not say it." Tessa waited. "I grew up believing that the people who love you show up for the ordinary stuff," he said. "The Tuesday dinners, the school pickups, the boring appointments. And I still believe that. But I learned something different when Nicole left. I learned that what really tells you who someone is whether they show up for the unbearable stuff, the 3 a.m. stuff, the stuff where there's nothing to do except be present and it cost you something to get there." A pause. "You drove to a hospital at 2 a.m. for a little girl you've known for 3 months. Not because I asked, not because you had any obligation. You just came as though it was the obvious thing, as though there was no version of tonight where you stayed home." The streetlights moved across the windshield at intervals. In the back seat, Wren's breathing was slow and even. "I'm not telling you this to put weight on you," Callum said. "What I'm telling you is that I see who you are, Tessa. Not who you were before the accident, not the version of you that exists in spite of everything that happened. I see who you actually are, the whole thing, and I am—" He paused, finding the precise word rather than the available one. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know what that means to me anymore. It wouldn't be honest." The city moved past. Tessa kept her eyes on the road ahead and felt the words settle into her, not the way Sloane's words had settled as a challenge or a correction, but the way certain things settle when they arrive at the right moment in the right sequence. Like something finding its level. She had been about to speak when the car stopped at a red light, and in the stillness she understood something she hadn't understood before. Every fear she'd carried since the garden had been built on the assumption that intimacy was something that happened to you, something you extended toward a person and then waited exposed and hoping to see if they extended it back. What she hadn't accounted for was the possibility of someone who had already been moving toward her all along quietly and without announcement, building a concrete path before she'd asked for it. "I've been scared," she said. Her voice was steady because she'd learned over the past year that the truest things were easier to say without drama. "Not of you specifically. Of the version of this where I open everything up and you eventually look at the full picture. Not the version you see now, but the 5 years from now version, the hard Tuesday version. The version that requires more than you anticipated and you decide the math doesn't work." The light changed. Callum didn't answer immediately and she didn't rush him. "The math," he said finally, "is not the frame I'm working in." He glanced at her briefly, long enough for her to see that he meant it without equivocation. "I'm not calculating what this costs. I'm thinking about what it would cost to walk away from it. Those are different problems with completely different answers." In the back seat, Wren made a small sound and resettled in her sleep. Tessa looked at Callum's hands on the steering wheel, steady, unhurried, the hands of someone with a long relationship to patient work, and felt the last of Sloane's distinction click into place. The risk of being wrong about someone was not the same as the certainty of losing them, and she had been, without fully realizing it, choosing the certainty. "I'm not going to do that anymore," she said. Not to him exactly, half to herself, the way you say something when you're closing a door. "I'm not going to protect myself out of something real." Callum nodded, once the same nod he used for things that had been decided and didn't need ceremony. "Take whatever time you need." "I don't need more time," she said. I needed to say that out loud. He didn't respond with a declaration. He didn't try to match the weight of what she'd said with something equal or larger. He just drove, and that was exactly right. The restraint of a man who understood that the moment didn't need anything added to it. When he dropped her home, she said goodbye through the car window. Wren stirred in the back seat, not quite awake. "Tessa, will you come to my school thing? I made a painting. It's really good." Tessa looked at the small face surfacing from sleep, entirely sincere, already moving forward to the next thing with the particular resilience of a child who trusted without calculation that tomorrow would have good things in it. "When is it?" Tessa asked. "Friday. There will be juice boxes." Callum was looking straight ahead, but the line of his jaw had changed. "Then I'll be there," Tessa said. She watched the car pull away and sat for a moment in the early morning quiet of her street. The fear wasn't gone. She understood it wouldn't simply disappear because she'd named it, that it would need to be chosen against repeatedly in ordinary moments that wouldn't feel like choices. But the weight of it had shifted. It no longer sat in her chest like a verdict. It sat there like weather present real and something she could move through. She went inside. She made coffee. She looked at the sign on her kitchen counter. "We're proud of you, Tessa." The dogs along the border, drawn with complete anatomical confidence, and thought about a 9-year-old boy who'd said, "Does it hurt?" and heard "not anymore," and found in those 2 words enough to start talking again. She understood something about that now that she hadn't fully understood in the courtyard. The "not anymore" wasn't the absence of pain. It was the presence of something else, something that had come after the pain and taken up residence alongside it, and gradually, without announcement, become the larger thing. She thought she might be in the middle of that same process. She thought she might be further along in it than she'd realized. She drank her coffee. The Hartford morning came up slow and ordinary through the window, and she let it. The school art show was held in the elementary school gymnasium on a Friday evening in late August, the walls lined with folding tables and the air carrying the particular combination of industrial cleaner and sugar that existed only in spaces designed for children. Callum was near the back wall when Tessa arrived, standing beside a small easel with his hands in his pockets, looking at the painting with the expression of a parent who had watched something come into being and was still slightly amazed by the fact of it. He looked up when she came through the crowd, and what moved across his face was unguarded relief that she'd come pleasure at seeing her no management of either. Wren had been watching the entrance. She crossed the gymnasium at speed and stopped just short of collision range, which she'd learned was Tessa's preference, and grabbed both her hands instead. "You came. I told Daddy you would. He said probably. I said definitely." "I said definitely too," Tessa told her. "I just said it quietly." The painting was mounted on a small wooden easel Callum had built himself, the joints cleaner than the store-bought ones nearby, sanded to a finish that had no practical reason to be that good, except that he didn't know how to do things halfway. The painting itself was tempera on cardstock filled with swirling bands of deep blue and gray that gave way across the right side to eruptions of yellow and burnt orange. In the lower corner, in careful block letters, "When Bad Days End," by Wren Foster. Age 6. Tessa looked at it for the real amount of time, not the polite amount. "Tell me about it." Wren stepped up beside the easel with the composure of someone conducting a gallery tour. "The dark part is all the bad stuff. When things hurt or you're scared or somebody makes you sad. See how it goes all the way across? That's because bad stuff feels like it's everywhere when you're in it." She pointed to the transition zone where the colors changed. "But this part is when it starts to end. Daddy says it always ends, even when it doesn't feel like it will. The yellow is when good things start coming back. I made it really bright because that's what it feels like when it happens, like your eyes need a second to adjust." Tessa's throat did something she'd have preferred it not do in a room full of strangers. "Your dad is a smart man." Wren nodded with the certainty of someone who had never doubted this. "He cried when I showed him. He said it was dust." Callum from behind them, structural debris, entirely different. Tessa looked back at the painting and let herself feel for a moment the full strangeness of standing in a school gymnasium, recognizing herself in a 6-year-old's interpretation of recovery. The dark part that felt like everywhere. The transition zone you didn't notice until you were through it. The yellow that needed adjustment. She had been in the yellow for a while now. She hadn't put a name to it until this moment. The evening moved at Wren's pace, and agenda introductions to classmates' commentary on other projects, a prolonged negotiation at the juice table. Callum stayed nearby without hovering, and Tessa noticed without remarking on it that he never drew attention to the chair and never ignored it either. He simply moved through the space with her as though the logistics of it were his to think about so she didn't have to, and when a narrow gap between two tables required a slight rerouting, he just found the route without announcement. Near the end of the evening, when families were beginning to gather coats and the gymnasium was thinning out, a woman Tessa didn't know stopped Callum near the entrance and asked with transparent curiosity, "Is that your—" And Callum said without a beat of hesitation, "That's Tessa," and turned back to the conversation as though the sentence were complete because it was. Not girlfriend, not friend, not any category that required qualification. Just her name said with the ease of someone for whom her presence needed no annotation. Tessa was across the room and didn't hear it. Wren told her later with the satisfied air of a witness to something that had been handled correctly. September came and Tessa took on a second weekly session at the rehabilitation center, this one with adult patients in long-term recovery. The work was different. Adults carried more complicated grief about what they'd lost, more resistance to the particular vulnerability of being helped, but her instincts transferred cleanly. She knew how to sit with someone who was angry about being in the room at all because she had been that person. She knew that the anger was almost never about the immediate thing and almost always about the fear underneath it, the fear of having become unrecognizable to yourself. She and Callum settled into a rhythm that had its own internal logic. Most weeks, sometimes more. He came to her neighborhood and she came to his. He introduced her to his work partner Doug, a man of few words and precise assessments who evaluated her once with the measuring eye of someone who worked with load-bearing structures and apparently decided she qualified because he never did it again. Wren began referring to Tessa without the qualifying language she'd used in summer, the way children do when a person has simply become part of the expected landscape. In early October, on a Sunday when the light through Tessa's apartment windows had the low gold quality of late New England autumn, she opened the drawer where Garrett's letter had been since July. She'd thought about it periodically, not obsessively, but the way you think about a room you've been avoiding acknowledging its presence without being ready to go in. She sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the pages. The letter was dated February 14th. He'd written it in the middle of the night, he explained, after an evening where he'd watched Tessa navigate a restaurant with a broken accessible entrance, watched her handle the host's incompetence with a grace he'd understood in the watching that he did not have the capacity to match. He'd realized then, not for the first time, but finally without the ability to argue himself past it, that his difficulty was not something she had caused and not something she could solve. That it was his own, rooted in a fear of uncontrollable things that had been present long before her accident and had found in her changed circumstances a surface to attach to. He'd written it and not sent it because he'd told himself he'd find a way through. He hadn't found it. He'd let the plans accumulate and the deposits get paid and said nothing, and that silence was the thing he acknowledged he'd carry longest. Tessa read it twice. She set it on the table. She let the full complexity of it be present without trying to compress it into something simpler. The vindication and the grief and the cold, specific anger of learning in retrospect exactly when someone had known and chosen not to tell her. She didn't try to skip any of it. Then she carried the letter to the kitchen sink and burned it with a long match. She watched it go. Not with ceremony, not with drama, just with the deliberateness of someone finishing a task that needed finishing. The smoke went through the vent. She rinsed the ash away and washed her hands. She felt afterward like a window had been opened in a room that had been closed too long. That same afternoon, Callum came by to pick up a jacket he'd left the previous week. He took one look at her face and said, "You okay?" "Better than okay." She paused. I burned the letter. He didn't ask which one. He nodded, once the nod he reserved for things that were resolved and didn't need reopening, and then instead of leaving he sat down on the couch and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and she recognized the posture as the one he had when he decided to say something. There's something I should tell you, he said. I've been doing it for about 6 weeks, and I haven't mentioned it because I didn't want it to be something you felt you had to respond to before you were ready. Tessa turned her chair toward him. The access to my workshop has been wrong since I took the lease. Threshold step door, too narrow gravel approach path. He said this factually without staging the revelation. 6 weeks ago I started fixing it, poured a concrete approach, widened the door frame, took the threshold flush, put in a grab rail inside. A pause. Nobody asked me to. I just kept thinking about you coming there someday, and I wanted it to be ready. I wanted you to be able to come and go the same way anyone else does. Tessa was still. I'm not telling you this to apply pressure, Callum said. I'm telling you because I think you should know that when I imagine what my life looks like going forward, you're in the picture. Not as a project, not as someone I'm being patient with, as someone I want there. He met her eyes. I should have said that more plainly before now. The October light lay across the floor between them. You widened the door frame, she said. The gravel was genuinely not workable. She looked at him with an expression that held several things at once, moved and amused, and something larger underneath both, something that had been building for months and had finally found the specific occasion it needed to become words. I kept waiting, she said, for the moment you'd do the math on all of this and decide it didn't come out right, that it was more than you wanted to take on. I didn't take it on, Callum said. I chose it. Those aren't the same thing. He leaned forward slightly. And I'm not looking at the chair when I look at you. I'm looking at you. The chair is part of how you move through the world. It's not what I see first, and it's not what I'm calculating around. She absorbed that. Not quickly, she'd learned to let things that mattered actually land rather than process them at a distance. I've been falling for you, she said. For a while. I kept not saying it because the last time I trusted the version of someone I thought I knew, the version turned out to be different from the actual thing, but I think you are who you appear to be. A pause. And I'd rather say it and be wrong than protect myself into something I'll regret. Callum crossed the room in 2 steps and crouched down to her level. The same movement, the same instinct as the first day, so habitual, now that neither of them remarked on it, and she kissed him with the full decision of someone who had done the accounting carefully and arrived without reservation at the right number. The months that followed were not a montage. They were specific and textured and real. A November Thursday, when Tessa came home from a brutal physical therapy session, too tired for words, and Callum showed up with food she hadn't asked for and sat with her while she ate it and didn't attempt to improve the situation with language. A Saturday afternoon when he took her to the workshop for the first time and she rolled up the new concrete path and through the widened doorway into a space that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil. And he showed her what he was building, and she thought with a clarity that felt like something settling into place. This is what it looks like when someone just does the thing without waiting to be asked. He brought her to Thanksgiving at his parents' house in Glastonbury. His mother asked Tessa about the therapy program with the interest of someone who actually wanted the answer. His father and Callum disappeared to the garage for 20 minutes, and his mother in the kitchen with Tessa said quietly, "He hasn't brought anyone here since Nicole. I want you to know that means something." Tessa said thank you, and meant it without being made small by it. Wren at the dinner table announced that Tessa had taught her the correct way to introduce yourself to a dog you didn't know, and that this was the most useful thing she'd learned all year, more valuable than long division, which was also important but had fewer direct applications. Winter passed. The rehabilitation program expanded. Tessa started consulting on accessibility modifications to the facility itself. She'd been navigating it for months and had a precise, practical list, and the coordinator implemented most of them within 6 weeks. Callum built 2 of the modifications on weekends and declined to invoice for the labor. In early spring he brought over the side table he'd offered to make months ago, cherry wood, the right height, the right depth, built with the kind of care that had no practical requirement to be that careful, except that he'd decided the person it was for deserved the full version of the work. When she ran her hand along the edge and felt the quality of it, she understood something she'd been understanding in pieces all year, that attention sustained and specific and offered freely was what love actually looked like underneath the declarations. May 14th fell on a Thursday. 3 weeks earlier, Callum had asked if she'd come somewhere with him that evening. He hadn't said where. She'd looked at him for a moment and said yes, because she'd learned over the past year that the things he asked for were worth the not knowing. They drove to Hartwell Chapel as the sun was going down, the May air mild and carrying the smell of cut grass and early roses. The parking lot was empty. They followed the stone path around the corner of the chapel wall and into the side garden, and Tessa stopped. Small, warm lights had been strung through the rose arch Sloane had come that afternoon. Tessa would learn later, and done this, and then taken Wren to a diner on the far side of town to wait for a phone call. White roses filled the bushes fuller than last May. Petals had been scattered along the path with a deliberateness that balanced the decorative and the genuine. Callum brought them to the center of the garden, the same spot. He turned to face her and crouched down as he always did, to be level with her eyes. He took both her hands. "A year ago I came around that corner and found you here," he said. "And I want you to know that I almost kept walking. I almost decided it wasn't my business and kept going. I think about that a lot, how close the margin was, and it makes me want to be someone who always stops." He looked at her steadily. "You were in the worst moment of your life, and you were still completely yourself. I didn't know you yet, but I could see it. Whatever had broken wasn't the part that mattered." The arch lights glowed warm behind him. Somewhere in the garden a bird moved through the wisteria. "You've shown Wren what it looks like to get knocked all the way down and choose every day to build something anyway. You've shown me what it means to be seen by someone who isn't looking past the harder parts to find the easier version." He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a small box. He opened it. The ring inside was simple and precisely made, a single stone in a clean setting, the kind of thing a person thinks about carefully rather than defaults to. "I'm not trying to overwrite last May. I'm not offering you a replacement for something that hurt you. I'm asking you to start something that is entirely its own thing." He held her eyes. "Tessa, will you marry me?" From the edge of the garden came the sound of small feet that had been holding still for considerably longer than was natural. And then Wren appeared, having been stationed at the garden entrance by Sloane, and held there through what Tessa would later learn had been a heroic act of sustained self-restraint. She was carrying a piece of cardboard painted in 6 colors. In her own handwriting, large and deliberate, "Will you be my bonus mom?" Tessa looked at the sign. She looked at Wren, who was holding the cardboard with both hands and vibrating with the particular energy of a child who has been part of a plan for weeks and is finally at the part where she finds out how it ends. She looked at Callum, still crouched at her level, the ring between them, his face completely open. No management of the moment, no performance of confidence. He might not feel, just him asking. She reached out and pulled Wren in with one arm and held her, and she felt Wren's small hands grip the back of her shoulder the way they had in the hospital waiting room, with the instinctive, uncalculating firmness of a child who had decided a long time ago that this person was hers to hold on to. Tessa pressed her cheek against the top of Wren's head and spoke quietly, meant for her alone. "You know it was you that first day. You sat down next to me without being asked. You handed me flowers made of petals off the ground like they were worth giving. You called me a princess when I felt like something that had already ended." She pulled back enough to see Wren's face. "You were 6 years old and you walked around that corner and you loved me without needing a reason. Do you understand how rare that is?" Wren's eyes were very bright. She nodded with the gravity of someone receiving important information. "So, yes," Tessa said. "To all of it, yes." Callum slid the ring onto her finger. Wren made a sound of pure, vindicated delight and wrapped both arms around both of them simultaneously, as though ensuring through physical means that this arrangement became permanent. "I knew it. she announced, to the garden, to the lit arch, to the May evening in general. "The whole time. I knew the whole time." Callum looked at Tessa over the top of Wren's head, and what was on his face was the expression of a person who has received exactly what they hoped for and hadn't been entirely certain they would. Uncomplicated, complete, the look of someone with nothing left to brace against. Sloane appeared from the garden entrance, phone in hand, already crying in the way of someone who had been crying for several minutes and had stopped pretending otherwise. She crossed the garden and put her arms around Tessa from behind, and Tessa reached up and gripped her arm and held on, and the four of them stayed like that in the warm May evening, while the arch lights glowed and the roses held their scent against the coming dark. The wedding was in August at Hartwell Chapel on a Saturday morning that arrived with the uncomplicated generosity of a New England summer at its best. The guest list was small family, close friends. The rehabilitation center coordinator, who had become something more than professional, Doug from the workshop, who arrived early and positioned himself near the back with the expression of a man who found the proceedings affecting but would not be confirming this if asked. Sloane did Tessa's hair in the bridal room, the same flowers wound through in the same way. This time, neither of them cried doing it. They talked instead the comfortable overlapping conversation of sisters who had been through enough together that the mode of communication mattered less than the fact of it. When Sloane finished and stepped back, she looked at her sister for a moment, the clean dress, the flowers, the ring, and said simply, "You look like yourself." Tessa checked the mirror. The person looking back was recognizable in a way that had not always been guaranteed. "Yeah," she said. "I do." The chapel held the particular quiet of a space that knows it's about to be asked to contain something. Callum stood at the altar with Wren beside him. Wren in a yellow dress holding a bunch of flowers she'd selected herself at the market that morning. Two varieties that did not technically coordinate and were exactly right. He watched the back of the chapel with the patience of someone who has learned through practice that the things worth having are worth the waiting. The doors opened. Tessa had thought about this moment across several conversations her father had offered. Sloane had offered, Callum had made clear he'd support whatever she chose. She'd taken a day and then said, "I'll go by myself." No one had argued because they understood it wasn't a statement about them. It was a statement about her, about the woman who had sat in this church's garden 14 months ago believing her capacity for a full life had been foreclosed, and who had been wrong about that, and who was now going to move through this space on her own terms, because that was the only way she knew how to do anything anymore. She moved down the aisle at her own pace through 2 rows of people who had come because they loved her, or Callum, or both, and she felt the full weight and the full lightness of it simultaneously. She had been wheeled and carried and carefully accommodated, and once in this very building abandoned. She had since navigated every threshold and uneven surface and narrow doorway her life required, and she had done it without apology, and she was doing it now, coming toward something she had helped build in a place that had first broken her open. Callum watched her come down the aisle, and his face did not perform anything. It simply showed what was there, the expression of a man who had made a decision in a garden 14 months ago and had been making the same decision in smaller ways every day since, and was looking at the proof that it had been the right one. When she reached him, he did what he always did. He crouched down to be level with her, unhurried, as though this were any of the 1,000 ordinary moments they'd spent at the same height on the garden path in the hospital waiting room on the floor of her apartment when the evening had gone long, and neither of them had wanted to move. The chapel was very still. The officiant, a friend of Callum's family who'd known him since before Wren was born, looked at the two of them and said, "I was asked to keep this brief because Wren has been standing still for some time, and that appears to be approaching her limit." Wren from Callum's right, "It's been really long." Quiet laughter moved through the chapel, and Tessa felt it the way you feel a room change temperature, the shift from ceremony to something more alive. The vows were their own, written separately, not shared until now. Callum went first, his voice level and undecorated, the voice of someone who had thought carefully about what he meant and did not need to amplify it. "I promise to show up, not only when it's straightforward, but on the days that cost something and the nights that ask for more than I planned. I promise to keep widening the door." He paused for a beat, "And I promise Wren that Gerald remains a serious candidate," Wren said finally, under her breath. Laughter again, warmer this time. Tessa looked at the index card in her hand, her own words written at her kitchen table 2 weeks ago. She looked up. She put the card away. "A year and 3 months ago," she said, "I sat in this church's garden in a wedding dress and believed the story was over. And then a stranger came around the corner and sat down in the grass next to me and didn't ask for anything and didn't explain himself and didn't leave." She looked at Wren for a moment, Wren who was gripping her bouquet with both hands, her eyes bright and her whole small self completely focused. "And his daughter called me a princess and meant it without irony and handed me flowers made of petals off the ground." Back to Callum. "I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about what love is actually made of underneath the versions that look good and the versions that collapse. What I've found is that it's made of the small, repeated decision. The choice to sit down, the choice to come back, the choice to widen the door without being asked and without making it a performance." Her voice held. "I see you, exactly as you are, exactly as you've been since that first morning. And I choose this, all of it, every ordinary day of it, for every day there is." The officiant said the words that made it legal and real and witnessed, and when he said, "You may kiss your wife," Callum leaned forward from his crouched position and kissed her in the quiet chapel with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, full, unhurried, completely present, and the room came alive around them. Wren's cheer was the loudest thing in the building by a significant margin. The reception spilled into the chapel garden in the warm August afternoon, the rose arch still strung with the lights from May. Sloane gave a toast that was exactly the right length and included one story that made the room laugh and one that made half of it cry, and she seemed equally satisfied with both outcomes. Doug ate 2 pieces of cake and told Callum in what he clearly intended as a private aside, but was audible to several surrounding guests, that he'd built the side table too well, and now the bar was set unreasonably high. Late in the afternoon, when the light had gone gold and long and most of the guests had moved inside to where the remaining food was, Tessa found herself alone in the garden for a moment. The party moved behind the chapel's stone walls, its sound softened by distance. The rose arch held its lights in the late sun, petals on the path from the day's ceremony. The stone bench where Callum had sat 14 months ago and listened to her talk until she could breathe again. She looked at the garden, the whole of it, without any of it being symbolic, just as a place where something had happened and then kept happening, where a man she'd never met had made a decision that cost him nothing and changed everything, where a child had sat down in the grass without being asked and handed her flowers made of fallen petals and called her something worth being. She looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about the workshop door widened at night by someone who hadn't waited for permission or certainty. She thought about a hospital at 2 in the morning and a drive home in the early light and a hand placed over a hand on a steering wheel. She thought about the painting in the school gymnasium, the dark that felt like everywhere the transition zone, the yellow that needed a moment to adjust to. She was in the yellow. She had been for a while. She knew that now. Callum came through the garden doorway and crossed to where she was, and without discussion he sat down on the stone bench beside her chair, and they were quiet together in the way they'd learned to be quiet, not the absence of something but the presence of ease, the particular silence of 2 people who no longer needed to fill the space between them to believe it was good. The August evening held them. The arch lights came up softly as the sun went down. Somewhere past the chapel wall, Wren's voice rose above the general noise of the gathering, explaining something with authority to someone who was clearly not arguing. Tessa looked at the place on the garden path where she had sat alone 14 months ago in a dress she'd chosen for a different life, and she felt not the absence of that morning, not its erasure, but its completion. It had happened. It had broken her in ways she'd had to rebuild carefully and slowly, and with help she hadn't known she needed. And it had brought her here to this specific garden on this specific evening, to a man sitting beside her on a stone bench, and a child whose voice she could hear through a chapel wall, and a life that had been built incrementally and honestly from something that had looked at the time like only wreckage. The petals on the path stirred in a breath of summer wind. The last of the daylight went warm and then faded. The garden was quiet. Everything she needed was inside the walls of this small place or just beyond them. She stayed.